In February 2022, the world watched as the second most powerful military on Earth invaded Ukraine, expecting victory in 72 hours. 3 years later, that same military is bleeding out in the mud, exposed as history's greatest military fraud. But here's what's terrifying. This isn't the first time. Throughout history, armies that looked invincible on paper turned out to be catastrophic jokes in actual combat, and the pattern that destroys them is always the same. The Russian military that rolled into Ukraine was supposed to be unstoppable. Western intelligence agencies predicted Kiev would fall in 3 days maximum. Russia had inherited the Soviet war machine, commanded over 1 million active troops, possessed thousands of modern tanks, controlled a nuclear arsenal that still makes nations nervous, and maintained the second-largest military budget on the planet. Every metric screamed superpower, but within the first week, the illusion shattered in spectacular fashion. Modern Russian tanks ran out of fuel on Ukrainian highways because generals had been selling that fuel on the black market for decades. Soldiers communicated using unencrypted civilian radios that Ukrainian farmers intercepted with store-bought equipment. Cheap Chinese tires on armored vehicles burst under normal driving conditions because maintenance contracts had been gutted by corruption. Entire battalions listed on official rosters turned out to be ghost units that existed only on paper, while their budgets disappeared into oligarch bank accounts. The world discovered that Russia's military strength was the most elaborate bluff of the 21st century, and now we're watching it collapse in real time. But Russia isn't alone in this humiliation. They're just the latest in a pattern that's been repeating for centuries. Look at Saudi Arabia right now. They command the 5th largest military budget on Earth, spending over $75 billion annually on cutting-edge American technology. Their hangars overflow with F-15 fighter jets. Their motor pools gleam with the latest generation Abrams tanks. Their bases bristle with Patriot missile systems. On paper, they're a regional superpower that should dominate the Middle East. In reality, they've spent nearly a decade struggling to defeat Houthi rebels in Yemen who wear sandals and operate with a military budget smaller than a single Saudi air squadron. The Houthis use improvised drones built from commercial parts and guerrilla tactics refined over generations, yet they've repeatedly struck deep into Saudi territory, hitting oil facilities and airports with embarrassing precision. Saudi air superiority means nothing when your pilots lack combat experience and your ground troops have zero motivation to fight. The problem isn't the equipment, it's everything else. Wealthy officers purchase their ranks through family connections, not battlefield competence. Troops drafted from comfortable lives have no ideological commitment to the war. There's no coherent military doctrine connecting all that expensive hardware into an effective fighting force. It turns out that buying the best weapons in the world means absolutely nothing without the training, discipline, leadership, and will to use them effectively. Saudi Arabia proves that money cannot buy military effectiveness. It can only buy the appearance of it. Now shift your attention to North Korea, where one of the largest standing armies in the world can barely feed itself. The regime projects an image of fanatical military discipline through endless parades of goose-stepping soldiers and propaganda that portrays them as an unstoppable force ready to defend the homeland. The international community treats them as a serious military threat. They shouldn't. The North Korean military is essentially an armed museum displaying Soviet equipment from the 1950s and 60s. They don't have enough aviation fuel to train pilots properly, meaning their air force would likely be shot down within hours of any real conflict. Soldiers are routinely pulled from military duty to work agricultural harvests because the country's economy has collapsed so thoroughly it cannot feed its own people. Their ability to wage any kind of prolonged conventional war is extremely doubtful. Yes, their artillery aimed at Seoul is legitimately dangerous, and yes, their nuclear program is real and should be taken seriously. But in an actual ground war requiring modern logistics, fuel supplies, spare parts, and contemporary tactics, The North Korean military would likely disintegrate faster than most people imagine. It's a force designed for parades and propaganda, not for sustained combat operations. Which brings us to a crucial question. If these modern armies are secretly hollow, has this always been true? The answer will shock you. Travel back to 1940 and witness France, possessor of what many military experts considered the best army in Europe, fall in just 6 weeks. France entered World War II with overwhelming advantages. They had more tanks than Germany. They commanded superior manpower. They'd constructed the Maginot Line, an elaborate system of fortifications designed to make invasion impossible. French military leadership believed they were prepared for anything. They were catastrophically wrong. When Germany launched its blitzkrieg strategy through the Ardennes forest, the French command structure suffered a complete psychological collapse. Orders contradicted each other. Communication broke down. Confusion paralyzed decision-making at every level. The supposedly invincible French army crumbled, and the entire nation fell in humiliating 6 weeks. But here's the ironic twist. The Maginot Line actually worked perfectly. Germany simply went around it through Belgium, a possibility French planners had somehow failed to adequately prepare for. The problem wasn't French fortifications or even French soldiers, many of whom fought bravely when given proper leadership. The problem was a catastrophic failure of imagination at the highest levels of command. French generals had built the perfect defense for World War I, not World War II. They assumed the next war would look like the last war, an assumption that cost them everything. France's collapse reveals something critical about military failure. Technology and numbers mean nothing when your strategic thinking is trapped in the past.
Cross over to Italy during the same period, where Mussolini's fascist propaganda machine promised to revive the glory of the Roman Empire. He boasted of millions of bayonets ready to conquer the Mediterranean and recreate Italy as a dominant military power. The Italian military on paper looked formidable, backed by a fascist state's total mobilization. In actual combat, they became the Axis power's weakest link and a constant source of embarrassment. Italian equipment was obsolete even by 1940 standards. Their tanks were so poorly designed that Italian soldiers themselves called them steel coffins. They suffered humiliating defeats against Greece, a nation with a fraction of their resources. In North Africa, British Commonwealth forces routinely destroyed Italian units many times their size. Italy's performance was so pathetically poor that Germany had to constantly divert troops and resources to rescue them, significantly weakening German operations across multiple theaters. The Italian military had the numbers, but numbers mean absolutely nothing when your soldiers fundamentally don't want to be there, when your equipment is garbage, and when your leadership is more concerned with propaganda than actual military effectiveness. Slide eastward to Imperial Japan, where the army carried a fearsome reputation for fanatical warriors who supposedly never surrendered. The Bushido spirit was real. Japanese soldiers did fight with terrifying determination, and their navy was genuinely world-class, but their ground forces tell a completely different story. The Imperial Japanese Army was shockingly backward compared to their own navy. Their tanks were too light and poorly armored to compete against American or Soviet armor. Their artillery was weak and outdated. They relied almost entirely on fanatical banzai charges and suicidal tactics, which caused casualties but didn't win strategic battles against enemies with superior firepower. When Japan fought the Soviet Union at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, they were absolutely crushed. Soviet armor and combined arms tactics exposed just how primitive Japanese ground warfare doctrine actually was. But Japanese leadership ignored this lesson completely, continuing to rely on fighting spirit to overcome material disadvantages. This delusion cost them millions of lives and ultimately their empire. Japan's story reveals that courage and determination, while admirable, cannot substitute for modern tactics and technology. Now witness Prussia in 1806, the nation considered Europe's ultimate war school. The Prussian army of Frederick the Great had been legendary, their military discipline and tactics studied across the entire continent. They possessed a hard-earned reputation for invincibility, built on decades of success. But they made one fatal mistake. They stopped evolving. By 1806, Prussia was fighting with tactics from 50 years earlier, and when they faced Napoleon at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, they were annihilated. The Prussian army, supposedly the finest fighting force in Europe, was destroyed by a French army that was faster, more flexible, and more innovative. The defeat was so psychologically devastating that it forced Prussia to completely reinvent its entire military system from the ground up. The Prussian collapse demonstrates that past glory means nothing in warfare. Only current capability matters, and the moment you stop adapting, you start dying. Go further back to the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, a power that had conquered Constantinople, terrorized Christian Europe for generations, and at its peak commanded one of the most formidable military machines on earth. But by the 1800s, the Ottoman military had decayed into a bureaucratic nightmare. Europeans literally called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe, and they weren't exaggerating. The Ottomans consistently lost territory to Russia and European powers throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. They stubbornly refused to modernize their command structures or adopt contemporary military tactics. Internal corruption was absolutely rampant, with generals embezzling funds meant for soldiers and equipment. The empire survived mainly because Britain propped them up to prevent Russian expansion, not because of any inherent Ottoman military strength. The Ottomans had vast resources and essentially unlimited manpower, but bureaucratic inertia and pathological resistance to change killed their effectiveness slowly and painfully. By World War I, they were essentially a German client state, dependent on German officers and equipment just to function. The Ottoman story shows that even centuries of military tradition cannot save you from obsolescence if you refuse to change. Travel to China during the Opium Wars, where the Qing Dynasty's catastrophic collapse reveals the ultimate price of arrogance. The king ruled what they called the Middle Kingdom, viewing China as the center of civilization and all foreigners as ignorant barbarians. This sense of cultural superiority was about to cost them everything. China was completely isolated from the Industrial Revolution's military applications, still relying on traditional warfare methods that hadn't changed in centuries. When British forces arrived during the First Opium War, the contrast was apocalyptic. Chinese forces faced Royal Navy steam-powered warships with wooden junks. Chinese soldiers charged modern artillery with spears and outdated muskets. The military humiliation was absolute and total, despite China's absurd numerical superiority. Qing leadership simply couldn't comprehend how catastrophically far behind they'd fallen. They assumed their ancient methods and sheer numbers would prevail, as they always had. Instead, they discovered that 10,000 men with traditional weapons cannot stop a single steam-powered gunboat equipped with modern cannon. The psychological shock of this defeat shattered Chinese confidence and forced the civilization to confront the reality that their centuries-old assumptions about their own superiority were dangerously wrong. The Opium Wars proved that isolation from technological progress is military suicide.
Fast forward to 1939 and the Soviet Union's Winter War against Finland, where a supposed communist giant was humiliated by a tiny Nordic country. The Soviet Union entered the late 1930s looking unstoppable on paper. Massive population, huge industrial base, millions of soldiers, seemingly unlimited resources. Stalin wanted to project strength before World War II, and the invasion of tiny Finland seemed like an easy opportunity for a quick propaganda victory. There was just one problem. Stalin had executed almost all of his competent generals during the paranoid purges of the late 1930s. When the Red Army invaded Finland in November 1939, Finnish soldiers on skis humiliated them in the frozen forests. Soviet tactics were rigid and incompetent. Leadership was terrified to show initiative,
and communication was chaotic. The Soviets eventually won through pure brute force and overwhelming numbers, but their performance was so pathetically poor that it convinced Adolf Hitler that invading the Soviet Union would be easy. Soviet casualties were staggering, possibly 10 times Finnish losses. The Winter War exposed every catastrophic weakness in Soviet military doctrine and revealed that Stalin's political purges had gutted the army's effectiveness. The Soviet example proves that political loyalty cannot replace military competence, no matter how many soldiers you have. Jump to 1991 Iraq, where Saddam Hussein commanded what was supposedly the fourth largest army in the world. They were veterans of a brutal 8-year war against Iran. They possessed Soviet tanks, hundreds of aircraft, and battle-hardened troops who'd seen intense combat. Western analysts predicted Operation Desert Storm would be a grinding, bloody conflict with thousands of American casualties and months of difficult fighting. The war lasted 100 hours of ground combat. Iraqi forces weren't defeated, they were erased. Coalition forces destroyed Iraqi positions so quickly and efficiently that it barely qualified as a war. But the technological gap only tells part of the story. Iraqi T-72 tanks literally couldn't see American M1 Abrams tanks destroying them from kilometers away in the dark because they lacked night vision equipment. Iraqi air defense systems were jammed or destroyed within the first hours. But beyond technology, Iraqi morale was absolutely terrible. Conscripts didn't want to die for Kuwait. Command and control collapsed immediately. Entire units surrendered en masse, sometimes to helicopters. The whole force structure was built on sand, held together by fear rather than competence or motivation. Iraq's humiliation demonstrates that experience and numbers are meaningless when facing an opponent with overwhelming technological superiority and the training to use it. So what's the pattern? What connects Russia in Ukraine to France in 1940, Prussia in 1806, the Qing Dynasty, and every other supposedly powerful army that collapsed when reality came knocking? It's simple and terrifying. These armies all confused appearance with capability. They believed their own propaganda. They assumed past glory guaranteed future success. They prioritized looking powerful over being powerful. Corruption replaced competence. Rigid thinking replaced adaptation. Political loyalty replaced battlefield effectiveness. And in every single case, when the shooting started, the illusion shattered immediately and brutally. The lesson is clear. Military strength isn't about how many tanks you have, or how much you spend, or how impressive your parades look. Real military power comes from training, leadership, logistics, adaptability, and the will to fight. Everything else is just theater. And right now, in 2024, we're watching this same pattern play out in Ukraine as Russia's military mythology dies in the mud, proving once again that in warfare, there is no substitute for genuine capability. The most dangerous thing any nation can do is believe its own propaganda about military strength, because when reality arrives, it arrives suddenly, violently, and without mercy. History has taught this lesson dozens of times, but nations keep forgetting it, and the price of that forgetfulness is always paid in blood.